Hey everyone, Matt here from Doctors of Running, where we normally three, but now we have one, an amazing PhD in exercise physiology, an amazing professor over from Texas. It's going to be the two of us today talking about some of the stuff that we put on our feet, the science and art behind that. And again, I am super excited to welcome Dustin, who is a phenomenal PhD and researcher, to the podcast. So Dustin, welcome.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so we're going to jump right into it. So tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of what motivated some of the interests in footwear and where you're kind of going with that.
Yeah, sure. So I am an associate professor at Stephen F. Austin State University, way out in deep East Texas in Nacogdoches, the oldest town in Texas is our claim to fame. I did my PhD in exercise physiology at Texas A&M. But I've been a runner, a lifelong runner. Ran in college, was a mediocre runner in college, and perpetually injured. Could have probably used your advice back then. And then over the last few years, I've gotten a little more serious with my running again, and have obviously been keeping track of the sort of updates in the running shoe market with the racing shoes, and decided to start kind of pursuing some research in that area.
Well, sweet. I think you and I had the exact same college experience where it was like heavily injured. I went the PT route to try to figure out how to fix those, and then went down an even deeper rabbit hole. And so, yeah, the footwear stuff definitely gets interesting. So tell us a little bit about, kind of what motivated you to start looking at this from a research perspective.
Right. Yeah. So, personally, I got my first pair of carbon plated shoes a couple years ago, or maybe, a little over a year ago, I guess. I picked up the Hoka Carbon X, and it was more affordable. I hadn't tried any of the Nike shoes yet, but obviously I'd seen the Kipchoge stuff and the Sub 2, and seen how the kind of running shoe market was changing. So I picked up a pair of those. I trained for my first marathon in those, raced my first marathon in those. And before I bought my second pair, I was like, well, maybe I need to test these in the lab to see if they're actually, because by then the Vaporfly papers that were out on showing improved running economy, but no one had really tested anything else. So I was like, well, I'll at least test this on myself. Got on the metabolic cart in the lab, tested at a few different speeds, and saw, at least for me, that Hoka shoe wasn't giving me any benefit. So I was like, all right, well, I'm not going to buy another pair of these. That at different points in time, the shoes have been hard to get. So I was able to get the Alphaflys at that time. And before taking them out on the road, I decided to test them on the treadmill to see if, maybe I was just non-responder, I was thinking, but no, definitely responded a good 4% plus in the Alphafly in terms of performance or running economy improvements. And so I said, okay, well, maybe there's just some differences in these shoes, right? And I hadn't run in enough of the shoes to really have known that yet. And so we decided to sort of try to get as many of the shoes as possible in hand and try to do a larger scale comparison to see what things were looking like.
So it sounds like there was a little influence from seeing some of the original studies. One of the big limitations was really only on the Nike Vaporfly. They were comparing it to the Adios Boost and the Nike Streak, but none of the other competitors had come out at that time. Were there any limitations outside of that in those studies that you saw that you went, hey, I'm going to try to do this better, or here's my curiosity, outside of the obvious one, which is just comparing all these different models?
Yeah, I think that's the big thing. When we looked at the previous lit, everything was on the Vaporfly line. And it wasn't even necessarily like big limitations in the previous studies, of just that was what was available. That was the first step being established. Right. And then all these other brands have come to market with their own carbon plated racer. And there's kind of been this assumption that we were forced to operate under, that maybe everything's equal now, right? But there's enough anecdotal evidence to maybe cause some people to question that. And so that was the real goal. It was just like, no one had compared any other competitor's shoe to that Vaporfly line.
And so I'm gonna ask a couple questions about how your methodology, but we'll also link your article in the description for this, both for those of you listening on, and then those of you watching on YouTube, you'll see that link there. But can you tell us a little bit about the subjects that you were able to get and why you were focusing on that group?
Yeah, so we chose to test at 16 kilometers per hour. That's kind of the most commonly tested speed for running economy in the lit, and is consistent across the previous Vaporfly studies that are out there. So to do that, though, to test running economy, you need to make sure people are below their threshold. And so you need to to test at 16 kilometers per hour, 6-minute mile pace. You need people who can probably run a 5K, like sub 17:30 was our kind of initial criteria. There's some other safety checks that you kind of make sure that they're operating at a low enough intensity during the testing, because we're wanting to make sure that they're staying in, like, all the metabolism is coming from the aerobic component, because we're measuring oxygen consumption to determine the energy expenditure. So that was kind of the level of runner. Some of the other studies have actually tested at faster speeds at 18 kilometers per hour, but then you need even faster people. And being where we're at in East Texas, it was hard enough to find, for a limited budget for the 8 shoes we were able to get, in only 3 sizes. So like size 10 to 11, you're limited in shoe size, speed of the runner. And we did this in the summertime, so we didn't even really have a lot of the local college cross country kids weren't even hardly here. So, I think that our average subject traveled like 180 miles round trip for each of their lab visits. So we had some dedicated subjects.
Wow. So for those of you not in the research world, when you take a look at how many subjects you have to be realistic and recognize a lot of people will come from very far away, and getting people to match the criteria that you need can be a nightmare. And that's something that I'm working on at the moment. So total respect to you on that. It can be really hard to control. There's a lot of variables that you have to control. So, and you had some very interesting results. I think personally expected the Vaporfly and Alphafly to be up there, but I was surprised to see one other one. Was there any other shoes that you were expecting to be up there that weren't? And I'll let you kind of tell just a brief thing about the results.
Yeah, so I guess, we were able to get 7 carbon-plated shoes, and then we had 1 control shoe that was kind of like non-carbon-plated, regular old flat. And I didn't, other than my experience testing the Hoka on myself, I knew we were going to have some shoes that were pretty, low responsive. Like not a lot of people were going to respond to that shoe, or wouldn't be very effective at improving economy. But I didn't really have much of a hypothesis beyond that. When I got the shoes in at like the same time we started the study, so other than kind of like squeezing on the foam and stepping into them, I figured we'd have some that matched up. I figured some we didn't, but I would have been just excited to write up my results if everybody had leveled up to Nike, right? Like I didn't have a lot to expect going in. So yeah, we tested the Vaporfly kind of being the consistent shoe that's been shown to be effective. The Alphafly performed similarly in terms of running economy improvements, which you would kind of expect, right? Given the similar technology in those shoes, same foam and stuff. But nobody had studied the Alphafly, so that was at least confirmed that. And then the other shoe that leveled up was the Asics Metaspeed Sky, performed similarly from a statistical comparison standpoint. So,
now moving away from the research a little bit, have you run in the Metaspeed Sky?
Yeah, so I've tested all the shoes myself, actually.
That's right.
So I've got my own data on myself.
Right.
And I like the Metaspeed Sky. I'm a big Alphafly responder, so like my biggest percent running economy improvements are in the Alphafly. But Metaspeed Sky is like second or third for me, right along with the Vaporfly. So.
Yeah, I should definitely know that, having gone through your Instagram and gotten to see all that stuff, which is like totally getting excited to see some, even if it's one subject, just getting to see some data from somebody who's a PhD and is going to know the methodology behind those exciting. So yeah, it's interesting to see what models are out there. So people can go look at more of the results on that. And it was surprising to me that a lot of the other shoes, like there was next to no improvement. I mean, like there was some, but really like those 3, the Vaporfly, Alphafly, and the Metaspeed Sky, and even the Metaspeed Sky, there's some distance between there, although, statistically that's another conversation. But those are really the only ones that are up there for all these ones that have been through it, sometimes a couple models, not always. So what we generally talk about here is, one of the big things from the literature is seeing that the foam seemed to play an important role. The plate is kind of questionable as to what exactly it's doing, whether it's actually improving running economy or stabilizing the foam, the maximalist stack height. So I'm curious to know, do you think there's something that's standing out in this footwear, or is it just the combination that Nike seems to have, and some other Asics may have just gotten close to getting right? Do you think there's one determining factor, or do you think it's really the combination? Is there some other stuff that maybe going on.
Yeah. So the one other thing I'd say on the shoes we tested, there was sort of a middle tier, right? Shoes that did give some benefit and improvement, but didn't quite raise up to the level of the Vaporfly line. And so that we saw that with the Endorphin Pro and as well as the RC Elite. We had the first version of the RC Elite. So there was some sort of like shoes that helped improve, but hadn't quite leveled up to the Nike, at least in the group we looked at. Right. But, and I guess that's important in line with your question. I think we probably are looking towards like the foam having the biggest impact, right, on like the energy storage and energy return. That's helping improve economy and decreasing the energy cost of running in these shoes. And, you know, all the shoes in the lineup other than our control shoe have a carbon plate in them. Most of them have increased the stack height. But the biggest thing that's different among them would be the foams. And it's tough to kind of pinpoint exactly what's in some of these foams or, you know, like the base material, like whether it's coming from EVA or TPU or PIBA, we know that a lot of the times, but kind of there's differences what happens from that original polymer to like what turns into the foam in the shoe. Like, you know, I think what stood out for me is like the Zoom X foam in the Nike shoes is PIBA based, and that obviously feels a whole lot different than the PIBA based Endorphin Pro foam, right? So that goes into the manufacturing process and the physics of it and all, and I we're kind of left in the dark a lot of times on what's going on there.
Yeah. Like, again, so even those, I'm fortunate that I get to talk to some of the developers on this stuff, and they won't share that. There's a whole other process besides foam, plate, and even the geometry of the shoe is another factor. The whole process of the foam and even the plate itself, that they don't tell us, that is proprietary. They own that, and they will not share that with anybody because that's like trade secret. So I think that's the important thing for listeners to understand is we can speculate on this, but we're still missing a huge part that we'll probably never get to look at, and we'll have to kind of make assumptions about. And that can be a little bit challenging, especially from a research perspective and trying to get through some of the marketing because this is a product at the end of the day and you got to sell this stuff. But those of us that are, whether we're clinicians or scientists trying to figure out what the heck is going on, it does leave us in the dark. Do you think there should be like more openness with that, or is this kind of the way, that's how it goes?
Probably wishful thinking, right? But I think there are some angles we could kind of approach things with, right? So if you look at the properties of the foam that are known to improve economy, if you look at the original Vaporfly paper that was done by the CU Boulder group, they actually that project was partnered with Nike, and so they actually had, I think, like from Nike's shoe testing lab, where they actually like measured some properties of the foam in terms of how compliant or compressible it is, which is important for how much energy it stores, and then also how resilient or how much it springs back, which is important for how much energy it returns. And that was the big thing with the Zoom X foam and that Vaporfly prototype paper that we saw. So if there's someone who's got like a soft materials engineering lab that's got that equipment, then they could be testing all these shoes independently and giving us info. I've reached out to an engineering lab at a nearby university, but the equipment is slightly different. Like it's not outfitted for shoe testing, so you need a shoe last that actually can like compress the whole entirety of the midsole. And so I'm exploring some options there. But yeah, if you had somebody independently testing in a similar fashion to that, you would think we could learn more about those midsole foams, maybe without having to do all the human testing. But
right.
But
so, yeah, there's
I think
many different.
After testing everything and having run and everything, you kind of get a sense of that, right? Like this one feels really soft, but it doesn't seem like it gives anything back to me, right? Or this one maybe like feels a little bouncy, but it doesn't compress at all, right? Like, and so you compare that to kind of what we know about Zoom X foam, and maybe can start to like at least subjectively get a little bit better sense. But
right. And so you have some of the stuff that you've tested on both yourself and the subjects that you were able to get. So we know, can you talk a little about, because most people probably don't understand when we do research like this, understanding who these results are applicable to and what information you can take away from that. So do you think these results are applicable to everyone, or is there anything else that people should be aware of in regards to choosing these shoes? What may be best for them, or maybe, not even choosing one of these?
Yeah. So I think in terms of like the expected benefits and sort of the generalizability of your findings, you look at who your subjects were and what you did to them, right? And so we had sub 17:35K runners. We were testing them at 6-minute mile pace. They were males only in this study. So, and they were, in the 135 pound to 165 pound weight range. So you start to get kind of narrowed down, right? We know from the previous Vaporfly papers, there's one study that looked at women as well, and pretty much from 14 kilometers per hour up to 18 kilometers per hour, we see similar findings across the lit in that Vaporfly line. So, you're talking 7-minute mile pace and faster. Things have been studied. So I think, in those pace ranges, in that demographic, you'd probably expect to see similar improvements. I think
That being said, I would like to shout out your funding page to get a bunch of these models for women, as I know you're trying to prep for a female-only study, which would be awesome because, yes, there's some literature on that, but men and women can have very different biomechanics. So,
yeah,
and physiological responses, from what I understand.
Yeah, no, I appreciate.
So shout out to check that out.
Yeah, and so in terms of extending these findings, like what's the next step? We are looking. I think this applies to both men and women, is what happens at slower speed. Should people, I kind of like asking like practical questions that the average runner would want to know, or like, where should I be spending my money kind of things. Right. And so we've done kind of the more widespread shoe comparison. And now I think a question a lot of people have is if I'm not a sub 7-minute pace marathon runner, right? I'm not running sub 3 marathons, then are these shoes beneficial to me? And we haven't seen any testing at those slower paces in the same kind of controlled way. So that's what we're looking at now. We're looking at the paces that would correspond to like a 3.5 hour marathon up to like a 4:15 marathon. What benefits the shoes have. So we're focused on the Vaporfly has been studied the most and is kind of the most consistently responsive like shoe for people. So we're focused on that one for the slower speed study. And yeah, that's what we're crowdfunding for, is to get, I have from the previous study, the shoes are still good. They don't have a whole lot of miles on them in the men's sizes that we had. And so we're crowdfunding to get women's sizes so we can include men and women. And yeah, I think, body weight's a factor, but as the saying goes, in like comparing men and women in research, women aren't just small men. So yeah, there's some biomechanical differences probably, right? So if we see differences in cadence and vertical oscillation, independent of, body mass differences, that might drive some different changes. But like I said, in the previous research looking at 14 kilometers per hour and faster, women and men responded pretty similarly. So, but we'll see when we look at slower speeds.
Right. I really want to emphasize that men, there might be some similarities, but men and women, at least, so I can't speak to the physiological standpoint as much because that's not my area of research, but from the biomechanical standpoint, men and women are very different. They have very differently shaped skeletons, very differently shaped pelvis, and very differently shaped feet. So one of the problems we had in the running industry for a long time was companies would do what's called shrink it and pink it, where they take a men's last in shape and just put pink colors on it, and that was the women's one, which does not work. And finally, some companies are actually starting to make women's specific lasts, i.e. shapes of the shoes. So from that regard, men and women can be very different. But from physiologically, I don't know as much of the lit on that. So you're saying based on the previous stuff, a lot of them have still been found to be fairly similar, at least at those quote unquote faster speeds. But when we start looking at more the average population, that might be different.
Yeah, well, I think at those faster speeds, the percent improvement in economy between men and women was similar.
Yeah.
I think one kind of working hypothesis would be like at slower speeds, or when like you're applying less force into the foam, maybe you get less of the potential like energy storing and energy returning benefit from it. And so the speed is a factor in that, slower you go, the less force you have going into the foam, but also then body mass differences, mechanical differences in terms of like cadence and, like I said, vertical oscillation. Right. So yeah, we'll see what sort of, if there's any interactions that play out there. But
Yeah, very interested. Have you, and you, with what your study, you also looked at perceived comfort, correct? Correct me if I'm wrong, right? In
We
terms of
did
our preference?
we did ask them at the conclusion of the study before giving them any feedback on their economy data. We gave them a little exit survey where they sort of ranked which shoes they would prefer to race in. And we also had them rate each shoe on, I believe it was softness and cushioning, stiffness and rigidity, and energy return. And so the idea there was to try to get at some of the subjective metrics that maybe would correlate to the economy improvements. Because there's so much subjective opinions out there on these shoes, and we don't really know how that leads to an actual performance outcome, though, right? And so that was kind of the goal with that. I don't know if we saw anything that's like very promising or any like really strong trends that would say we can ditch running economy testing. I think people tended to. So if I just asked them like, which shoe would you race a 5K in, and we asked them also which shoe would you pick if you're racing a marathon. People tended to make better shoe decisions when they were thinking about marathons, not 5Ks. So meaning they picked the shoe that was more economical for them when they thought about things in a marathon racing mindset than in a 5K mindset. And I think there's this tendency to just like say, oh, this shoe was really light, so surely if I was racing a 5K, I would use it though, or like it felt lighter, right? Whereas like the Alphafly felt like bulky and big, and even though that might have been their most economical shoe, they wouldn't like consider it for a 5K, even though it probably would be the best shoe as it had the best economy benefits, right? So we saw that a little bit. And then some of for the most part though, like the group average rankings for shoes kind of correlated, but like people weren't great individually at picking their best shoe. I think only a couple people in the study like picked the shoe that was best for them in that subjective ranking.
That's interesting. We've seen similar data, where the data is even worse actually for people being able to identify their own movement. So like people being able to identify where their foot is landing is like, it's horrible. Like people cannot tell. Even experienced runners are almost totally off when trying to predict their own foot strike. So based on that and some of those initial results, which it might be a little early, what do you think on people trying to self-select shoes for the best performance? And performance is, I should say, best economy, I should say, technically.
Right. I mean, from our data, I don't think people were great at it. I don't think they had, maybe you give people like the objective feedback. Like, all of our participants now have seen their like case study results. And they kind of know maybe, okay, this is what I'm feeling in this shoe that's giving me that energy return. Right. So, maybe after that they're better at it, but yeah, on the front end, before any objective feedback, people really weren't that great at it. I think we talked about some of those properties of the midsole foam, like what you're looking for, right? Something that compresses but also gives back. But without comparing a lot of stuff, that's hard to do. That's the other challenge with these shoes. You can't just walk into like a specialty run shop and compare all 10 shoes side by side, right? Like these things are hardly stocked anywhere. You got to go online, and you're not going to buy 10 at a time and make a decision, right? So that was one of the reasons that our subjects had to come from far away for a study, but it was their chance to just basically come in and try all these shoes, right? So we had really reliable subjects.
That's awesome. So based on what you've seen, what words of wisdom would you give people in terms of if they're coming to you asking, hey, how do I make a shoe decision, especially if I'm looking at economy? So let's not talk about 5K. Let's talk about, since most people are generally going to be having these long-term goals of running a half marathon or full marathon, what would be your words of advice for them for selecting shoes? Or do you have any? Or do we really need more information?
Well, so I think in like the current environment with the new shoes that are coming to the market, I think one is, has this shoe been like validated as like effective at improving economy in a research and study, right? So we've got a few shoes that have done that now, right? Two, if they haven't, then it really kind of depends on your level, like what level of athlete you are. I think we make the suggestion in the paper that, if you're an elite athlete and you don't know if like this shoe's been tested and this shoe's not established, like you should be running economy testing in a lab, I mean, you need a metabolic cart, which is an expensive piece of equipment, but a lot of university labs and an exercise physiology program department are going to have a metabolic cart that probably for a fairly like small fee when you're considering like implications for elite athletes, could do some testing. Most of this testing you can do in like, if you're comparing 3 or 4 shoes, you can do most of this testing in a single day. So yeah, I think, you know, athletes with access to something like that, that would be a big part of my decision making process. And I've talked to since this study, since we posted the preprint of our paper, talked to a pro runner and triathlete about some of this, like kind of consulting. No one's near Nacogdoches to come in to test in our lab, but how they might go about doing that. And you've actually seen that. Outside Magazine did a story on Mandy Elmore when she signed her Saucony contract, right? She went in and tested Saucony against the Vaporfly, and for her, they were performed similarly, right? And so that's, you know, she was really economical to begin with, I think, and so she might be on the lower end of responsiveness. But when they compared her to the Nike shoe, it didn't seem like she was losing anything, and so she made that decision. And so that's really like the wisest thing, right? Is if you can do individualized economy testing. But for the average age grouper out there, probably not so feasible, right? We can still test people. We do. People go into labs for like, you know, you pay $100 for a VO2 max test. It's basically the same time commitment for us, and we're using the same equipment for submaximal VO2 measurement. So people who are already willing to do something like that, it might actually not be that impractical. But yeah, otherwise I think you got to look at like what shoes have been studied, which ones have been established, and you're kind of guessing otherwise right now, I think.
So I know what you're talking about. I'm curious to know if our audience does. When you say responsiveness in terms of individuals responding to these shoes, what do you mean? Can you give a little bit more background on that?
Yeah. So, you know, we showed here that those top 3 shoes, like statistically, were better than the others. And that means that just about for everybody in the study, those were the top shoes. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to make those like conclusions, right? But within those top shoes, you see a range of responses, right? So like the average for the Alphafly in our study was 3%, but we have some people who are like close to 5% responders and others who are maybe barely 2% responders. And so some people are getting more benefit than others. And so we think some of that varies based on, you know, how economical you are to begin with. It makes sense that people who have poor running economy maybe can get more benefit from the shoe. We think maybe there's some mechanical differences. Yeah, no, that goes for me too. I'm very uneconomical in my middle-aged dad years here, so I need all the help the shoes can give me.
I was laughing when you said that. I think on social media somewhere, I was thinking the same thing, where I think both of us have mechanics where people go, how are they moving forward? Somehow we do. So yeah, that makes there's not a lot of elasticity left in my lower legs and feet, and I'm like a 4.5% responder in the Alphafly. So, but you know, we think maybe there's some mechanical differences, but really everyone's been trying to do these shoes work, and now can we compare these different shoes? And no one's really like designed a study to say like, okay, these are a bunch of people who are low responders versus high responders, and what are the differences in them? You need sort of larger samples to look at those different groups of people. So I think more of that will come out as we get more data on these shoes, but yeah, it's harder to say exactly for now. Yeah, it's hard enough to find sample size, let alone do like a large one with responders and non-responders. So that hopefully, like I said, as we get more people interested in this, and then hopefully people are more willing. And, you know, there's some other things going on right now in terms of the world right now, in terms of how willing certain people might be to come out and go in a public place. So hopefully that'll start to calm down here. So we've gone through a lot of the sciencey stuff. I'd love to geek out with you a little bit more right now in terms of like your personal opinions on some of the stuff. So I was super excited that we got to send you the Deviate Nitro Elite. You've gotten to test the Adios Pro 2. Can you talk us through some like personal favorites and things you have liked and disliked about some of these shoes?
Yeah. So
just things that have stuck out for you. And
yeah, so we've been talking about our actual like formal research study where we have multiple subjects and it's powered by statistics. And, but I'm also a big believer in self-experimentation. And so that's kind of the idea behind my Instagram account, was to share some of our larger scale research, but also sort of my LabRat testing. So, so I've done a lot of case study testing on myself just because, hey, I've got the equipment. I want to know what shoe I should spend my money on and what shoe I should race in, right? And yeah, so, like I said, I've tested all of the shoes that were in our study. I'm a big responder to the Alphafly. So now I kind of, anything I test as a case study, I always test myself compared to our standard control shoe, the Alphafly, and then whatever is new. And so, yeah, you guys were awesome and sent me the Deviate Nitro Elite, which everybody was interested in after Molly is in her medal in the Olympics, right, in the marathon. So that one, I like that shoe. So when I put a shoe on now, I kind of like feel out how springy the foam feels. Like that's like the first thing I cue in on. Right. And I thought that foam felt pretty good. It's just like, it's a petite shoe. It doesn't have nearly like the stack and the amount of foam that is underfoot and in the Alphafly definitely, and even in the Vaporfly. Yeah. So that was my sense. I like wanted more foam. I think in my case study testing, I think I was my typical like 4% or so in the Alphafly and around 2.5% in that shoe, which is definitely a meaningful improvement. And maybe in some smaller, lighter weight individuals or individuals with different mechanics, that shoe might be better for them, right?
Yeah, it is interesting that the for those listening on the podcast, I'm holding up the original Deviate Nitro Elite. The stack height isn't nearly as high. I can't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but especially compared to the Alphafly, right? That shoe has a ton of foam underneath it. I'd be super curious, by the way, off topic for you to if you can get your hands on the Adidas Adizero Primex. I just managed to get my hands on a pair of those thanks to somebody on eBay at a discounted rate because they're so expensive. But that shoe is like terrifying, where I'm like afraid to run in it. But like in terms of like stack height and foam, there's so many factors, and the Deviate Nitro Elite feels great. I think it's probably one of the more comfortable ones for me, which is interesting. And we've talked about comfort, and I wouldn't necessarily associate that with performance and economy, but they did a good job. The foam is comfortable. What do you think about the Adios Pro 2?
Yeah, so I had a thought before that. What was it?
Yeah, go for it. For it.
No, I think I lost it though. It'll come.
Deviate Nitro Elite.
Come to me.
It was, was it comfort and performance? Was that
maybe something? So maybe something with the case study stuff.
Yeah.
Well, so yeah, I did get the Adios Pro 2. So that was like the obviously, like if you look at our paper, the notable omission was we didn't have the Adios Pro 2, and it wasn't like, hey, these dummies don't even know that Adidas has like the other third of the market share, or all of these fast elites running in this shoe. We just weren't able to get it. So like between like spring break of last year, when I got the grant approved and got the money, and you're trying to get like as many of these shoes as possible in a 2-week time period, it was a tough task. And so the ones were sold out in the Adios Pro, and then the twos that like were about to come out but weren't out. And so that was the one shoe we weren't able to get. But yeah, so I got that recently, tested myself. I didn't do well in that shoe. And like I said, when I kind of put my foot in a shoe now and feel how springy the foam feels, that foam feels a lot different than Zoom X. And so obviously there's a lot of people running really fast in that shoe, right? Like elites. And it's tough, right? Because you've got, some of the fastest athletes in the world are in contract with either Adidas or Nike, right? So naturally that anecdote's going to drive that direction, right? But yeah, it would have been awesome if we had that in the lineup to see kind of like what tier it fell in. It's hard to think that it like wouldn't be a top tier shoe just because of how fast people run in it. But my personal testing data tracks really well with like the group average data in our study. And for me, that shoe didn't do great on me, but that's not to say that it's not helping other people. So, but that I definitely think that foam felt a lot different, but.
It's a very different foam, and it felt very different. David and I tested the original, and I was not the brightest and bought it super early, like probably a pre-production version. And the foam in the first one feels way different. And I've gotten a chance to try another production version that felt even more different. So like the Light Strike Pro is going to feel, a lot of these I feel like are going to may vary depending on the production model that you get. I'm wondering, there's some other
that's
stuff
interesting because if you look at what the pro, I always say, like, you can't blindly trust the anecdote, but we should like kind of like follow what the anecdote is showing us. And a lot of the pros are running in the ones, aren't they?
Yeah, they are, which is, to me, based on my experience with the original, I like it, but not for racing all out. It's kind of more like that lightweight trainer-ish. But I think what I have right here is totally different than the other production models, because this was an early stock X grab that I'm like, my wallet is still hurting from. So I'm not doing, this was great. I will never do that again. But yeah, so I think there's some variation of the foams, because yeah, a lot of people are still running in the original. And so, again, different responders, different mechanics, different stuff like that, and people are still running races. It's interesting to now finally see on the world stage, it's not just Nike, Vaporfly, or Alphafly anymore in the top three. It's, you're getting more of that like Nike, Adidas with the occasional other brand in there, which is what it used to be before the Vaporfly came out. So I feel like things aren't necessarily leveling out, but like it's slowly equalizing, at least in terms of performances. And there's a lot of other factors going into why people are performing at a super high level right now. I'm not, this line of research is on shoes, but obviously there's a lot more that goes into performance than just shoes alone. So, the thought that I had earlier, you asked about the Primex, and so that kind of goes hand in hand with the Adios Pro 2, which is I think just more of the same foam, right? And so I had some people, I've got people who have requested like what shoe I test next on my case study testing, and that one's on the list. But I don't think I'm going to try to get a hold of that shoe, just in the sense that I didn't do well in the Adios Pro 2, so I wouldn't expect. So this was my thought, is that if you have good foam, you can add more of it probably without much of a penalty, or maybe even more benefit, right? If you have bad foam, and this isn't specifically to the Adidas shoe, but if your foam is not great, adding more of it is probably going to occur at a cost, right? Like, so typically we always just thought, a heavier shoe is less economical, right? But we don't live in like that world anymore with this fancy foam that can like actually give you more benefit, right? So that's like the Alphafly is heavier than the Vaporfly, but a lot of people are more economical in it, despite the shoe being heavier, right? So there's different properties in the shoe that are now actually like that extra weight is not coming at a cost, is actually coming at a benefit. But I wouldn't expect that to be the case with like foams that don't work as well, right? Adding more of something that doesn't work well for you might not be beneficial in that case, right? There's also the factor that, like, especially, I know if you're a recreational runner, this might not be as important for anybody that's like competing. You can't compete in the Primex, right? So it's like technically for IAF, like that stack height is illegal. So kind of what's outside of a marketing tool, what's the point of buying that? Especially that one guy who ran, I forget, was it the Amsterdam Marathon, who won and got disqualified, which I cannot imagine a more horrible thing. Like, hey, I won this thing, right? I'm going to get some money, I have a good payday, and then like, oh, just kidding, because of the shoes you wore that your company has. Like,
Well, I think that was an Adidas like sponsored race though, so that whole thing seemed peculiar to me, whether or not that was like a publicity thing or...
Hey, I mean, marketing is marketing. I'm not judging it. I've learned a ton about that talking with people now about like, you and I geek out about like the physiology, the mechanics behind this stuff. But like I said earlier, at the end of the day, it's a product, right? You're trying to it's a business. You're trying to sell this stuff. So I can't judge fully. I think along with you, I'd like to have more evidence instead of just marketing, but going, what really is the best? And I think the idea of having personalized VO2 or like economy testing is really cool. I think it's a huge thing that I think people should start asking.
That's a good point, because I think it hasn't been like that foreign for endurance athletes to seek out laboratory-based VO2 max testing or lactate threshold testing, right? And, the other big performance predictor is economy. And so, especially in light of the potential benefits of these new shoes, I definitely think any athletes who are willing to like spend the money on those other physiological testings, it would make sense to work in some of the economy testing.
So I also, speaking of economy positives or negatives, I was super impressed that you did economy testing wearing Crocs. I have to give you massive kudos. I've seen plenty of people run in those. I cannot imagine running in them. Was that comfortable? Or
it wasn't too bad, but my economy was terrible in them.
it was horrible. Yeah. A good training tool for training, not for racing.
Yeah. So when I put out the poll of which shoe I should test next, I think it got a little hijacked by some funny guys there. So it was also a lot easier to convince my wife to let me buy a pair of Crocs as opposed to the Adios Pro 2s. So we tested those first. No, running that pace, and then I've been testing everything from my case study stuff at like 6:15 pace.
Yeah.
That wasn't too terrible, but the fit of that thing is just floats around on your foot a little much. I think the trick is thicker socks. You needed thicker socks.
Got it. That makes sense. It's like Blister City.
Yeah.
But I'm just impressed. I've seen people run like fairly quick half marathons and marathons in those, and I'm like, oh man.
Yeah, there's some guy
that data now.
Some guy out in Utah, I think, it's like a sub 15 5K in Crocs, like a 106 half marathon in them. So he's a beast.
That's impressive. He might want to consider a Vaporfly now at this point, but it maybe he's just not a responder. He's a responder to Crocs. Who knows?
Yeah, well, or he's at least not 8% worse like I was in him.
He's not. So how do you convince? So going through all this, and I'm assuming the answer is this is for science, but how do you convince your wife about these shoe purchases? I'm sure there's a lot of people who have that same question, or for some people, it might be their husbands, right? How do you convince your spouse, right?
Yeah. Well, so the only shoe I've actually, I think, I've had the Alphaflys that I've raced in since like way back when I originally tested, but the only shoe I've bought for like the LabRat stuff so far is the Adios Pro 2. So I'm working to not actually like just spend my own money on every possible shoe. We'll see where the case study testing goes. That's been fun for now, but we'll kind of see where that goes with the LabRat account. But for the actual my job research-based testing, we've been able to get a small like internal grant for the first study. We've still got those shoes in stock. So a lot of the shoes I have from the previous research that until these things have probably 40, 50 plus miles on them, I think they're probably fine. But all of them right now have like less than 20 miles on them. So we're able to use them again. But yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, so actually, I think that's one of the best part of our study's findings, I think, is like convincing your spouse on what shoe you should spend your money on, right? It's like, hey.
I should definitely buy this one because based on my evidence, this is the only one I need to buy, right?
Yeah.
If I have to test this out and I have to buy all these things, it'd be way more expensive. But now I know I just need this one.
Well, I think of it as like, this shoe is $50 cheaper, but I'm 4% better in it. Like, okay, this just makes sense, right? Plus, I did triathlon for several years while I was in graduate school, so our sport is cheap compared to that. So,
yeah, anytime before I was fortunate to have this website, we got shoes sent to us, I complained about running costs, and I had friends when they were triathletes, and I'm like, your bike costs more than my car.
Yeah.
And I'm like, yeah, and I have 3 of them.
Yeah, so I sold my bike, so I can buy shoes now.
Oh gosh, that's impressive. That is truly going both for personal running stuff, but also for science as well. So that's impressive. I'm curious to know where. So if companies are listening to this, do you have any words of advice for them? So if the footwear developers who are now reading this stuff and making thoughts, what would your words of wisdom be to them?
Oh man, I think that's above my pay grade.
If there was no pressure, right?
Man, I think it's so. This is a whole conversation that really is like the business end of things that I'm not an expert to speak on. I think it's tough. Like I feel for the smaller companies, like how are you going to keep up with the R&D of Nike?
Right.
But yet you still feel the pressure to like put out a carbon plated racing shoe. And I think it's tough for like elite athletes who are like, well, I want a contract. I want to be supported, but I also don't want to like sign a contract with a shoe company that maybe is hindering my performance. I just think it's a tough environment. Like, I know these companies. I think the curious thing of me as like a consumer and scientist would be like, surely these companies have internal testing. And I know from talking to a pro runner who had a contract with another company, that they have data. And, I think most of these companies, if they wanted that data out there, it'd be out there. So that's kind of, I don't know, that's tough. There's a lot of, like you talked about earlier, like a big part of the business is the marketing end. And I think that's a whole other podcast episode where you need somebody other than just me around to have that conversation.
It's what we've been having that conversation for a while. Again, none of us are business people, right? We're all science-based clinicians. And so it's a whole different environment about, we get asked that all the time, both from people reading our website. And that's actually a question that's jumped up when we've talked to different companies of what words of advice we have. And we're like, well, it's going to depend heavily on the resource you have. Like, I mean, that's the challenge is Nike. Did you see the new science center they just opened? It's like how many billions of dollars? And I was drilling over like the number of force plates they have, which I think was like 80 or 80 something. And I was like, it's hard enough just to get one or two, like just let alone like 80 and having that many, like it's just going to be hard with resources.
Yeah.
And so,
yeah. And one of the things we called for in our paper is like, if companies want us to believe that their shoes offering some benefit, right, then they should support like independent laboratory testing. And so there's means to do that, whether it be donating shoes or, you get some conflict of interest as like a researcher if you're getting supported by a company. But I think, donating shoes for testing purposes is probably okay.
That's pretty mild.
And I mean, in consulting at least with, somebody who's got running economy experience or metabolic cart. Like I said, I think a lot of the companies do have access to that in-house, or at least some lab that they could contract with. And yeah, if you've got a product that works, then put that data out there, right?
Right. It'd be nice to share because a lot of companies do have this data. They, as you said, they do have their own, a lot of times exercise physiologists on staff. There's a couple, shout out to a couple of biomechanists and PTs that are on staffs in various companies, but I know this stuff is proprietary. I know it's a business. It would just be nice to be able to see some of it or at least support independent labs to be able to say, hey, this is what's going. But I can see why if they already knew that maybe their product wasn't quite matching up, that they may not release, that stuff. It's hard, right?
Yeah,
that's very difficult.
And
so that's the where you start, science versus business is really hard. And then you get into other issues of, risk of bias and stuff like that, which, you and I in the literature, we see that every day where people, I forget what I was reading. I forget what I was reading, but it was some study on, I don't remember if it was vibration or what was it, but the lead author on there owned a company related to the product they were testing. At the very bottom, it said no conflict of interest. And you're like, I'm pretty sure if you're the owner of a company that the product you're testing and there's a large, so that's where this gets complicated. And so that's why, what makes it challenging for independent labs to get this stuff and put data out there is, this stuff is expensive. I can't believe that shoes cost $200+ now. I still remember back in the day when I was working in running stores where I got a pair of Adidas Tsukumi Sen, which that was an expensive shoe. That was $160 back in the day. It was hard to get that in the United States. And I got it through one of our Adidas reps who ordered it through Japan, and it was still $160, and that blew my mind. And now you've got shoes that cost almost double that, and you're like, people are just throwing money at it. It's like,
yeah.
Again, no complaint. I know the triathlon world, there's other sports that are way more expensive. But it's just,
but it is hard. Like if you think about labs that are going to do this testing, the grant money in our field is going towards things like cardiovascular disease and diabetes, and rightfully so, right? And while endurance nerds and runner nerds like us are interested in this stuff, it's not like there's just grant money laying around to go buy up 10 grand worth of shoes to do this kind of testing, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, so being in my PhD right now, my initial stuff was on footwear, but I got torn apart because they're asking me hey, what's the larger benefit to society? And I'm like, why are you asking me that? There's some great info. And they're like, well, just because it's going to depend on your grant funding. And I'm like, oh, so it's that makes this additionally hard for those of us that are shoe geeks and want to know this stuff, right? It's challenging, but it's awesome you're getting grants for that. That's great. That probably speaks to your experience in being an awesome PhD and be able to write some good grant papers.
I wouldn't go that far. For our original study on the large shoe comparison, I was lucky to get some internal funding, and we're able to stretch that money out as far as possible. I've got a buddy I ran against in college. he operates Fleet Feet Austin. And he was able to hook me up with some good discounts. He made our money go a long way. So
Nice.
in terms of what we were able to purchase, so that was really helpful.
That's awesome. Shout out to the local running companies for helping support research on that.
Yeah,
that's
for
awesome.
sure.
Because again, those things, yes, small running companies.
When I think, that's what it takes, right? Like if we're interested in this niche stuff, you're going to need like support from different angles like that to make these kind of things happen. Like my running friends are like, "What? No one's compared this yet?" And I'm like, "No, man, nobody cares about this. So nobody with money cares about this."
Yeah, that's the problem. It's like everything goes toward like, major cardiovascular diseases, or in my interest in biomechanics, it's, especially in PT, it's fall risk in older individuals, or, looking at mechanics associated with different large scale pathologies, whether it might be, neurological diseases and stuff like that. So for those of us interested in more of the running, and even getting into running is more niche, and that's hard enough. And then you start adding running shoes.
Yeah.
And so well, some of the obstacles that I am just beginning to learn as a PhD student. So you've gone through this in your list, but it's like, being able to get research out and get good research out is hard. There's a lot of obstacles. So congrats on being able to get out and get something out and be able to put some data out there. Like, I liked it. I thought it was great, but congratulations on that. So you're correct me for it's preprint. It's been accepted. Correct.
So it's preprint. It's under review currently. So
under review.
Hopefully
currently,
should hear back soon from reviewers on that. But the preprint's been out. That's
awesome. Well, good luck on that. Because getting feedback from some of these journals takes forever. Sometimes, like the first one we worked on took like 6 to 8 months just to get anything back.
Yeah, that's it. It varies journal to journal, but definitely the scientific review process can be a little slow sometimes. And so, but the posting the preprint stuff while something's under review has become more common over the last few years, and so that's a nice way at least to let the world see it who's interested, and they can critique it.
Right.
So.
That's a good way to get feedback too. I didn't think about that.
It is, yeah. Actually got some pretty good feedback from some big time biomechanists on it. So
that's awesome. Something you wouldn't normally get just from the one journal. That's awesome. That's a good idea. Plus, you also have a great Instagram, which again I encourage everyone to go follow, especially looking at some of the science. We're really big into getting people to understand the science behind this stuff, and Dustin has done a phenomenal job of putting out not only great data but some great thought-provoking questions and ideas about, what are we putting on our feet? What really is giving us the biggest economy improvement? What does that mean, right? So it's putting us together. So I encourage everyone to go listen to that, to subscribe and check that out, because it's got some great data and stuff. Well worth reading.
Thanks.
So Dustin, any last comments you have, or for people, again, big stuff going, what shoe should they choose?
I think for fun follow-up stuff, and I'll be posting more stuff on our study too. But on that LabRat rundown Instagram page, like we're talking about, doing research like this is tough. You need people with like special interests that are willing to back it. So I can send you that link, but that link's also available on my Instagram page too for crowdfunding our women's shoe line right now, so that we can continue that with both male and female subjects. Hopefully more interesting stuff to come.
Sweet. So more interesting stuff on both ends. As always, please check Dustin out on it's LabRat, right?
LabRat rundown, yeah.
LabRat rundown on Instagram. There's going to be more great stuff coming. Obviously, check us out too. Doctors Running. We're always following Dustin, try to repost and see what he's doing too. So yeah, really great content. Dustin, is really great to have you, and thank you not only for being on here, but also for doing what you're doing and getting data out there, because we just need more data. We need to see what's happening so people can make better and better informed decisions about what they're putting on their feet. And because we understand that these are products and there's a lot of marketing, but we also want to help people make informed decisions, because at the end of the day, you want to have fun with this. You want to stay healthy and make some good decisions about what, and shoes are part of that. So thanks, man. I appreciate you coming on.
Hey, thanks, Matt. Enjoy the chat.